Good morning to the citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis. I've been invited to address you this morning as a former Minister of National Security in Jamaica. I hope that by sharing this experience, it will help you to better inform policies and programs for violence reduction in your country. Jamaica has had a long history of violent crimes. If you look at a graph of murders in Jamaica over the last 2 decades, you'll see that it has consistently been at epidemic levels. So during my tenure as minister, I tried a different approach. Traditionally, high levels of violent crime have been addressed by hard policing and draconian legislation with stiff penalties for firearm offenses, and so on. In fact, the current government has used states of emergency as a serial and routine tool of policing without any success. During our period, we tried a different approach. We tried to balance crime control with crime prevention measures. And in fact, we changed our philosophy of addressing violent crime. We considered, or we adopted, the epidemiological approach to addressing violence as an epidemic. And I would say we had some success. If you look at the average annual murders in Jamaica for the last 16 years, and in fact, although the chart shows 16 years, if you went back to another 8 or 10 years, it would reflect the same thing. We actually had, during our 4-year period, 2012 to 2015, the lowest average annual number of murders for decades. On average, perhaps about 25% lower than otherwise. So we were probably doing something right. Unfortunately, when the administration changed, they abandoned these policies and returned to the old methods, which have not worked. So if we take the public health approach to addressing violence, just like any other contagious disease, you reverse an epidemic in 3 phases. The first phase is to interrupt transmission of the disease. That involves the traditional crime control measures, saturating the areas with police. In the case of Jamaica, we also have soldiers who routinely support the police in their policing activities. So you would have, apart from heavy saturation policing, vehicular checkpoints, cordons and curfews, etc., we also introduced an element into it that we call violence interruption. And this involved training trusted persons from within communities that were traditionally plagued with violence. And we gave them particular training on how to break the cycle of violent incident, reprisal, and counter-reprisal that could mushroom from 1 victim to 8 or 12 or 16 in a very short period of time. And we engaged a series of NGOs, like the Peace Management Initiative, to assist in that effort. The second phase of breaking this epidemic or reversing the epidemic is preventing future spread. And we did a number of measures to assist in that regard. The first was in capacity building. And one of the things was to introduce legislation that really targeted the source of the violence. In our case, and throughout the Caribbean, gangs have a dominant role in promoting violence and being both perpetrators and victims of violence. So one of the pieces of legislation we introduced was an anti-gang bill. And essentially what that did, it introduced a whole new set of conspiracy type offenses so that members who were involved in organized crime could, for example, be prosecuted just for membership in a criminal gang. They could be prosecuted for leadership in a criminal gang. They could be prosecuted for supporting, providing assistance in any way. And this was in addition to the predicate offenses, whether murder, shooting, extortion, etc., which gang members might commit. So that strengthened the hand of the police. We also made amendments to the Proceeds of Crime Act, so we could seize assets that were gained through organized crime. We put a limit on cash transactions and so on to make it much more difficult. And of course, there was the asset forfeiture side of the Proceeds of Crime Act. We introduced an anti-scamming bill. Essentially, scamming is what is more formally referred to as advance fee fraud. And that was a source of hundreds of millions of US dollars to organized crime, scamming at the time primarily elderly American citizens. In 2014, we estimated that figure was 300 million US annually. Today, it is estimated to be 1 billion US annually. One final very important capacity building or tool for law enforcement was we passed a DNA Evidence Act, which allows law enforcement to compel a suspect to give a sample of their DNA. This has been revolutionary in addressing violent crime generally, but in particular, the crime of rape. Today, we have seen, since the introduction of this bill, about a 75% reduction in those offenses and an almost 100% clear up and conviction rate for that offense. We also upgraded the forensic capacity of the Ministry of National Security, and we ensured that we had mobile police posts that could go into communities where there was a flare-up and provide a permanent police presence. Of course, the police were not limited to the post itself. The police were patrolling the community, but they had a base from which to operate. And as you see from the picture on the slide, these portable posts were on a chassis so that they could be moved from one area to another as conditions demanded. The final thing we did from that building capacity era was to strengthen or to increase what's called the strength of the police, the number of boots on the ground. And the Caribbean has one of the lowest rates of policing per 100,000 population in the whole region of Central America, Caribbean, and Latin America. The final area I would just speak to in terms of building capacity was in terms of mobility. Vehicles are a force multiplier for police officers. We spent a considerable amount on patrol cars and motorbikes, which often can get an officer to a scene much more quickly than a patrol car can, particularly in the context of Jamaica, where either you have a lot of traffic in urban areas or you have informal communities with very narrow roads, sometimes just pathways that to get to people's houses. So that is a critical force multiplier. So I move now to the third phase of reversing the cycle of an epidemic, and that is to change the group norms. In Jamaica, we have what I would describe as a dysfunctional subculture in many ways. We traditionally had a very oppressive stance, a very anti-youth stance in terms of possession of small personal use quantities of ganja, we call it, or marijuana as it might be more widely known. So we decriminalized that possession during our term in office. What was the result of that? We reduced persons charged with possession of marijuana by 12 to 14,000 each year. What that meant is that 12 to 14,000 young men largely were given criminal records, which then excluded them from much of the formal economy. Typically they couldn't get a visa or any type of overseas work permit. They couldn't work with the government or many financial institutions, etc. Eliminated personal criminal records from participating in the mainstream economy. Of course, that made them much more vulnerable to recruitment by gangs and getting involved in illicit activities. I sometimes like to say that this figure you see on the slide is a representation of Anansi, a sort of mythical trickster that I think our culture is sort of reveres in a interesting sort of way. And of course, there has been historically a reluctance to assist the police. We refer to it as the informer for dead culture, where communities would ostracize anybody who is believed to provide information to the police. And I think it reflects a general lack of trust between community members and police officers. These are the things in our culture that we have to challenge successfully if we want to move forward. Gangs recruit school children. We have cases where young boys as young as 12 years old have been arrested as shotters. And they're said to be fearless because, they probably don't even understand the implications of what they're involved in. But crime statistics really are the outcomes of failures or weaknesses in many different elements of the society, starting with the family. Cycles of violence generate cycles of trauma. We have many young offenders, even some of those very young shotters that I referred to earlier are kids who were abused as children. The studies show, academic studies show that 60% of Jamaican children were exposed to parental physical abuse. That is a bit dated. Those studies were done about a decade ago, but I don't think anything suggests that has changed dramatically. 50% of gang members don't know their fathers at all. And, there's tons of statistics that show that children without a father figure in their life are subject to much more risk. They're 11 times as likely to display violent behavior, 9 times as likely to join a gang, 6 times as likely to end up in prison, and twice as likely to drop out of school. And we could go on with failures. School, 86% of gang members, a study done by the Peace Management Initiative show that 86% of gang members had dropped out of school by the 9th grade. So if we can just keep kids in school until the 12th grade or keep them within that formal structure, they're much less vulnerable to gangs. And we can go on and address all the areas. Physical environment, we need to create safer public spaces, safer public housing, control the disorder in our public spaces and in our communities. In terms of policing, we have to reculture the police force, improve accountability, downplay the paramilitary style of policing, and emphasize instead proximity policing, or what is sometimes called community policing. Finally, we took a multi-sectoral approach to community safety. We recognize that it's not just the Ministry of National Security, but it has to partner with ministries of education, youth and culture, justice, health, local government, labor, and social security. So we came up with an initiative to get this partnership, this national partnership going, and we called it the Unite for Change Initiative. It involved communication, it involved coordination, it involved membership. It engaged local partners, NGOs and the private sector, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, media, and the creative industries. And it had positive outcomes in terms of sustained reductions in violent crime and in the fear of crime. We also made citizens participate. We empowered citizens to participate in their own safety through a cutting-edge app called the Stay Alert app. This type of app is common today, but 10 years ago when we introduced it, it was cutting edge. So in closing, let me commend to you a whole of society approach to addressing the issue of violent crime. We call it uniting for change, getting all hands on deck to address crime. And I close by thanking you and giving you a few seconds of a video that we used in Jamaica in launching that Unite for Change initiative. Thank you.
When families collapse, schools fail to educate, the economy does not produce enough jobs, we turn to law enforcement to save us. Nothing could be more wrong. It gives law enforcement an impossible burden, and worse, it takes all of us off the hook. The task is to launch a strategy that engages the energies, passion, and commitment of all. And that is what the Unite for Change initiative is about. We're really inviting every citizen to come together to make his or her community safer.
I live in the Dunkirk community 34 years. And right now, the community is running smooth. No violence, no crime. People in the community dialogue with the police and also the Pastor Allen and Brother Bugs. And I would like Southside, Rockford, Poilers, Telaville, everybody to come together and move like Dunkirk. All right now, I like how Dunkirk can move. God believe me.